All right, welcome to your long weekend note session. I know you guys probably don't want to do this, but thank you all for watching this video. Let's recap what we've talked about for so far. Okay, you're probably like, Ms. Frankson, I don't need to do this. Yes, you do. We're reviewing. Okay, so we talked about waste. Okay, we talked about the fact that developed countries like the U.S. create more waste. Okay. We also talked about as the population continues, the amount of waste is going to continue. We talked about types of waste. So most of our waste is industrial, 97%. 3% is municipal solid waste. Okay. Of our municipal solid waste from homes and households and towns, majority of it is paper. Okay. We talked about e-waste and how it can contain harmful toxins like cadmium, mercury, and lead. And we've talked about the hierarchy. What is most desirable? Well, we want to reduce, right? And an example of that would be source reduction. So reducing packaging at the source. Then comes reuse, then recycle, recover, and finally disposal. Okay. We talked about recycling, closed loop and open loop. So closed loop would be recycling it into the same product. Open loop is recycling it into a different product. Okay. We said a lot of times there's not a market for certain types of products like plastic and glass because it takes too much money to produce them, and it's cheaper just to make a brand new one than to actually recycle it. And we talked about composting, and then we ended with landfill, right? So we talked about our waste options. We can put it in a landfill, which is where most of our waste ends up. We can burn it or we can bury it, okay? So in order for things to decompose in a landfill, they need air. And so a lot of our stuff does not decompose in a landfill. Here's a picture of a landfill. So we left off with this diagram, okay? And this diagram is what we're going to color. So if you don't have colors, go find some. You can do this later if you would like as well. The waste is going to be yellow, so you're going to want to go ahead, color the waste. Why am I having you color this? You're like, Ms. Franks, and I could just label it. Well, when you actually color things, you are actually processing it differently than if you just label it, and a lot of times it sticks in your brain better. So I used to have my anatomy kids do this all the time. We would color code diagrams because it helps you remember it better. So we have our waste, okay? Leach it. Remember, if it rains, okay, rain coming down on my landfill, some of the water is going to run off, but some of it's going to go through the landfill, and the stuff that goes through the landfill, it's going to go to the bottom, and it's going to get really nasty down here. It's going to have a lot of toxic chemicals, and so we have pipes to collect that. So here's our leach it pipe. So that's going to be red, and that's going to send it to a water treatment facility. Water is going to be one of our next units, so we'll talk about what happens and how we treat that water once it gets to the facility. All right, a plastic liner, okay? So the plastic liner is going to be blue. You don't need to really know which order the plastic liner is as compared to the clay liner. Generally, they would probably do a clay liner being the topmost layer. And the reason we have this liner is to prevent any of this leachate from going down into the surface, okay? Going down into contaminating the groundwater, contaminating the dirt, all of that. We have our clay liner, which is going to be orange. So what is this? It's just a bunch of clay. You guys know clay is a good barrier because it is pretty much waterproof. So we're going to color that orange. It doesn't allow water to go through, and that's because, remember when we talked about soil particles, clay particles are super, super small, right? So we talked about sand, silt, and clay. Clay is the smallest, okay? We have our topsoil, which is going to be green. Again, you see some different layers here. I'm just going to color the top part. We might have, we a lot of times have clay that's going to be on top of the soil as well. So I'm just going to color one of these layers orange. Again, you see another layer here. Don't worry too much. We're just getting the general idea of what a landfill is. And then methane. So remember we said there's no air in here. So the organisms that kind of try to break down stuff produce methane. Again, same organisms that live in cow's stomach, they produce methane. And we have pipes that are going to collect that. And those pipes can go to a factory, and that factory can burn the methane and make electricity. There's my little smokestack. And so they can use that methane. But a lot of that methane actually escapes into the air. And remember, we said it's a greenhouse gas. And a greenhouse gas is going to warm or contribute to the warming of the planet. Okay, so those are all of your different components. So then what materials are going to go into our landfill? What do we actually put in our landfill? We talked about recycling. Okay, and so with recycling, we want to recycle as much as possible. But if there's materials that are difficult to recycle, for example, we talked about glass. Oops, sorry about that. We talked about glass. Sorry, this should say glass. Let's write that. Glass or plastic. If it's difficult to recycle and we're not going to get a lot of money, then we would want to put it in a landfill. Okay. Again, plastic is kind of an iffy one because we can recycle it and get a little bit of money, but not a ton of money. Glass is not super conducive to recycling, and so it's really hard to recycle. It takes a lot of energy, and so a lot of our glass should probably end up in a landfill. What should we not include then? Okay, do not include metals, electronics, or toxic materials. Okay, so for example, electronics, we talked about e-waste. All of them have those harmful toxins in them. Any kind of toxic chemicals, we'll talk about those. Those are considered hazardous wastes. Those would be like paint or chemicals or cleaners. Okay, we don't want to put recyclables in the landfill. We don't want to put food waste. And food waste is one of the big producers of methane, right? That greenhouse gas, because it's going to try to decompose. So we see this little chart down below, okay? So this is Children's Guide to Using the 3-bin system. This is for a municipality that does a 3-different system for their trash. So they have organics. A lot of European countries do this where they have all their food scraps go in one container and then they compost them, okay? So they wrote here, if it grew once, it goes into the organics bin, right? We said organic means living. Recycling, okay? Everything except plastic bags here, but plastic bottles, cans, paper, all of that stuff. And then what goes into a landfill? Again, we see chip containers, little pouches, diapers, okay, stuffed animals, anything else that's left over. And again, no hazardous waste, no batteries, no really toxic stuff. Now this stuff is going to be somewhat toxic, but not really, really toxic stuff, okay? So where should we put landfills then? Okay, we should make sure that they're located away from water because we don't want any accidental contamination to happen. So like in this picture here, we have a landfill. We have the water table, meaning this is the water level and where we have a whole bunch of water being stored. And this landfill is contributing to leach it all the way down into the soil. Okay, and it's going to contaminate that drinking water. All those toxic chemicals from those batteries are going to go into that drinking water. We also want to put it in clay. Remember we talked about clay? Clay has some properties that basically allow it to be really good for a landfill. So it doesn't allow water to go through it, right? Because clay holds water, or it prevents water from going through it really well. That's why we use a clay liner. So we can kind of contain the area from the landfill if we have a bunch of clay in the soil, okay? So what are some problems then with landfills, okay? So first of all, we have not in my backyard syndrome. This is called NIMBY, okay? What is it? Well, it's exactly what it says. People are saying, not in my backyard. Well, sure, we should have landfills, but just not in my backyard, okay? You don't necessarily have to write anything down for this slide, but I need you to understand that a lot of times people are like, oh, we should have dumps, we should have landfills. And they say, but as long as it's not in my backyard, because they don't want something toxic or hazardous or something that's an eyesore in their backyard. So where do these things end up? Well, they end up in low-income areas where these people don't have the resources to basically fight it. So in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a landfill was created in a low-income area because people lacked resources and money to mount opposition. So if you're rich enough, sure, you can sue somebody, you can create protests, you can get a whole bunch of people behind you to say, oh no, we don't want this landfill in my backyard. But if you've got a lot of low-income individuals, they're not going to have the resources to do that. So this is looking at this landfill, okay, and this is percentage of households below the poverty line. And so the low-income area was a lot of black individuals, and they were mainly below the poverty line, okay. So when we look at some of these not in my backyard syndromes, a lot of times they're in marginalized or low-income communities. And so there's some ethics that go along with it. Is that okay to do that, right? Are they any more deserving of a landfill in their backyard than anyone else? No, but they just don't have the resources. All right, problems with landfills, okay? So problems with landfills. Leach it. We've talked about that. It's a liquid that contains elevated levels of pollutants because it passed through waste or contaminated soil. So a lot of times this is like rainwater. Okay, it comes in through the landfill, it filters down in, and then it gets real nasty. Okay. We see some of this like leach it, some of this runoff, very nasty. Here are some leach it pools. Gross. Okay. So they have these pools where it collects, and then it's sent to a waste treatment facility. So there's a couple different options for this. But imagine if any of these leaks, it's going to be a big problem. So we get contamination of rivers, streams, and groundwater. Okay. Now, when our things start to try to decompose, they produce methane and CO2, both of which are greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases, remember, are responsible for insulating our planet and contributing to climate change. The other problem, methane is explosive. So think about natural gas. Okay, natural gas is, if you have a gas stove, that's what you use to light your gas stove. Methane is explosive, okay, kind of just like natural gas or propane, right? And so it can generate some really hazardous situations because we're producing all this methane gas, and if we don't collect it and store it properly, it can cause explosions. So those are the main problems with landfills, okay? So landfill, that's where most of our trash ends up. We can also burn it, okay? So incineration is our next option. So you just need to write this on that bullet point. You don't need to leave extra room. So incineration is burning waste materials to reduce volume. So reducing the amount of space it takes up. So if I have a whole bunch of logs and I burn them, it's going to turn into a small amount of ash, right? So the ash takes up less space. And what do they do with that ash? Well, a lot of times then it still ends up in the landfill, okay? But it takes up a smaller space. And sometimes they burn these things in order to generate electricity and in order to generate heat. So we can use some of this burning to our advantage. Here's an example of an incineration facility. There aren't as many of them around as there used to be. Usually they have a tall smokestack. They're pretty nondescript. So what's the problem then with burning it? Well, instead of having all of our waste go into a landfill, some of it now is going into the air. So it creates what we call bottom ash. So bottom ash is the residue that's collected in the furnace. It's literally the ash. Okay, if you burn a log, it's going to create some ashes. It's the ashes. And then fly ash. You guys have seen this. When you have a fire, right? Some of the ash some of the ashes go up into the air, okay? That's fly ash. Why? Well, it's flying away from the fire. And a lot of times this is collected in a chimney, okay? But some of it still goes into the air, okay? So if we look at this diagram down here, I will give you more time to write in a minute. Here's what's happening. All right, we've got a crane taking the waste in, gonna burn it up, okay? Here we have all the ash, the bottom ash, okay? And you also see there's some dirty water here. There's going to be a chimney, okay? So notice all of this is going out to the chimney, okay? So this is where the fly ash would be, all up here. And what happens is this heat boils the water, which creates steam, and then it turns a turbine. Think like a wind turbine, okay? And that generates electricity, all right? So when we generate some of this ash, all right, it goes into this thing called a scrubber because this ash is really toxic and really dirty. Okay, so the ash may contain toxic metals. And so what they do is they have this thing called a scrubber to remove some of these toxic metals. And basically it adds water and the metals go into the water and then the water goes into the waste treatment. Okay. So the ash contains toxic metals. They're either going to go into the dirty water. Some of them are going to go into the air. The bottom ash is going to go into a landfill. And it can generate heat. Okay. So this can be used for heating or for electricity. And this is called a waste to energy system. Why? Because we're taking waste and turning it into energy. And again, there's been AP questions on this, on how do we generate electricity from waste? Well, basically you burn it, you use the heat from the steam to boil the water, or the heat, sorry, to boil water and turn it into steam, and the steam turns a turbine, which is connected to a generator. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about energy, but know that this is kind of an important principle. You're going to need to know how we generate electricity. Basically, there's always steam and a turbine and a generator. And so usually somehow we end up producing heat to make steam, okay? So waste to energy plants, how many of them do we have? In Wisconsin, we have 2. I'm going to have to look up where we have them because I don't know off the top of my head. Minnesota has 9, New York has 10. Those are the big numbers. Other states don't have any. So they're not super common, okay, waste to energy plants. We're going to look at this a little later. Last option, this is the last thing we'll write down, then we'll be done. Burying, we can bury waste, okay? And how is burying different from a landfill? Well, you don't have a clay liner, a plastic liner, you don't have that top part, you literally just bury it in a hole. You don't have those leach-it pipes, you don't have the methane collection, you just bury it. So approximately 60% of U.S. waste is buried in open dumps, and they're not covered, it's just literally a heap of trash. And waste is piled as high as you can. It's really, it's more rare in developed countries, but you'll notice 60% of our waste, we're a developed country, is buried in open dumps. But it's widely used in the developing world. They don't have the materials and resources to make a beautiful looking landfill, okay? So what they do is they just bury it. And this can create problems, as you can imagine, because there's no protection of our groundwater. You know, we've got pests that are going to get attracted to this dump pile. So really unsanitary conditions here that are not covered up. So lots and lots of issues. So those are the 3 options for solid waste: landfill, incineration, and burying. Okay? All right, I will see you all back here on Monday. Thanks for tuning in.